"If you fix this engine, I'll give you my entire salary," mocked the millionaire to the humble mechanic, and then stood in shock at what she did. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Robert Mitchell walked into a mechanic shop for the 8th time, on the edge of losing his patience and his mind. The engine of his 1970s Chevelle SS, his personal treasure and the pride of the Mitchell family, had died right in front of Barnes & Sons Auto Repair, a garage tucked away on a side street in Brentwood, Tennessee. Robert looked at the place with disdain. "Is this where engines come to say goodbye?" he muttered to himself. The sign on the front was crooked, with some letters missing. Dust-covered tires were stacked outside. He sighed. This was all that was left. He walked to the shop entrance. At the back of the garage, he saw someone bent over the hood of an old truck. Dirty boots. Greasy jeans. A figure that looked just as old as the shop. He walked over and asked, not hiding the sarcasm in his voice, "Is there anyone here who can fix a real classic?" The person stepped out from under the hood. She wiped her hands on a worn cloth, lifted her face, and answered with a sharp smile, "I'm the mechanic, Sarah Barnes. I can take a look at your car." Robert went silent for a moment. She was young, covered in grease, looked ordinary, and far too confident. He raised an eyebrow. "You?" She nodded. "That's right. Miss, with all due respect, I've taken this car to 7 specialty shops. No one could figure out what's wrong with the engine, not even the best engineers in Nashville." Sarah crossed her arms, leaned against the truck bumper, and replied with a half-sarcastic smile, "That only happened because you didn't come here first." Her boldness almost made him laugh. "Almost. If you fix this engine, I'll give you my entire salary," he said with a mocking smile. Sarah smiled back, with even more sarcasm. "All right, but I want it in cash." Robert blinked. Her reply hit his pride like a slap. He expected a "just kidding" or a polite laugh, but she didn't even flinch. She just walked over to a rusty cabinet, pulled out an old toolbox with the name E. Barnes, handwritten on it, and walked up to the Chevelle like she was about to open a family secret. "Pop the hood?" she asked. Robert did it without thinking. Sarah studied the engine for a minute, like she was listening to something no one else could hear. She took a piece of hose, touched it to the engine block, and listened closely from the other end. Her expression was serious, but calm, experienced despite her age. In less than 10 minutes, she removed 2 parts, made a manual adjustment to the ignition line, and cleaned the connectors with a short bristled brush. "Try it now," she said, stepping back. Robert climbed into the car, turned the key, and the Chevelle roared. Just like the old days. Deep, steady, clean. He shut off the engine, stepped out, and looked at Sarah like she had just done magic. "How did you?" he stammered. "It was just a reversed connection in the ignition system." "Your engine was asking for help," she said, shrugging. Robert tried to collect himself. "How much do I owe you?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Your salary." He laughed, but the smile quickly faded. I was joking." She stepped forward and replied in a calm tone, but with piercing eyes, "My dad used to say a man's word is the word of a king, and a king doesn't go back on it. Are you a man, Mr. Mitchell?" He froze. "Tomorrow I'll bring the money." "I'll be here," she said, already turning back to the truck she had left open. Robert got in the Chevelle, started the engine, which now purred like a satisfied lion, and drove off without looking back. But inside the car, he bit his lower lip, defeated by the only mechanic who didn't try to impress him. She just did what no one else could, listened to the engine, and broke his pride along with it. Robert Mitchell spent the whole night crunching numbers. His monthly salary as chief engineer at Mitchell Automotive Industries wasn't small, $15,000 after taxes, enough to buy a brand new car, enough to make any Brentwood mechanic smile for a month. But it was also enough to bruise his pride. The next morning, he parked the Chevelle in front of Barnes & Sons Auto Repair at exactly 9 o'clock. The engine still purred perfectly. A constant reminder that a woman with dirty hands had done something the best Nashville experts couldn't. He stepped out of the car with a thick envelope in the inside pocket of his blazer. Cash, just like she asked. But Robert Mitchell wasn't a man who accepted defeat easily. Sarah was in the same spot as yesterday, bent over the engine of a faded blue Ford F-150. She wore the same grease-stained jeans, but today had a plaid shirt tied around her waist. Her hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail. Nothing glamorous, nothing remarkable, and yet she had outsmarted all his knowledge in 10 minutes. "Good morning, Miss Barnes," he said, trying to sound casual. She looked up without stepping out from under the hood. "Oh, you came back. I thought you'd forgotten our conversation." "A Mitchell never forgets a debt," he replied, pulling the envelope from his pocket. $15,000, just like I promised. Sarah wiped her hands on a rag and took the envelope. She opened it, counted quickly, and nodded. "Word of a king," she murmured, putting the money in a dusty drawer behind a stack of old manuals. Robert expected her to be impressed. He hoped for a thank you, or at least a smile. But Sarah simply went back to the F-150's engine, as if $15,000 were pocket change. That bothered him more than it should have. "You know what, Miss Barnes?" he said, crossing his arms. "I want to see if yesterday wasn't just luck." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "Luck? We've got an engine at our factory that's been giving us trouble for 3 weeks. A whole team of engineers hasn't been able to figure it out. Want to give it a shot?" Sarah dried her hands slowly, thinking, "Why would I do that? Curiosity? Money?" Robert shrugged. "Take your pick." She stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. "If I fix that engine, you treat me with respect. No more condescending miss, no more side glances, no more testing if I got lucky." Robert hesitated. There was something in her voice that unsettled him, a kind of authority he didn't expect to find in a place like this. "Deal," he said, extending his hand. Sarah shook it firmly. Her palms were rough from work, but her grip was confident. "Then let's go to your factory." Mitchell Automotive Industries was on the other side of Brentwood, in a modern industrial complex with glass buildings and paved parking lots. Sarah stepped out of her faded red pickup and looked at the place with interest, but not intimidation. Robert led her to the development area, where a team of 5 engineers stood around a V8 engine laid out on a metal workbench. All of them wore white dress shirts and ID badges. "Everyone," Robert said, "this is Sarah Barnes. She's going to take a look at our issue." The engineers exchanged looks. One of them, a middle-aged man with glasses and a blue tie, frowned. "Is she a specialist consultant?" he asked, giving Sarah a full once-over. "She's a mechanic," Robert replied. The silence that followed was awkward. Sarah noticed the dismissive stares but didn't seem to mind. She walked to the bench and studied the engine carefully. "What's the problem?" she asked. "The engine starts, but it loses power after a few minutes," explained a blonde female engineer. "We checked injection, electrical system, cooling. Everything looks normal in the tests." Sarah nodded and asked for a pen. When no one offered, she pulled a blue pen from her pocket and began making notes on her own left arm. Numbers, simple diagrams, reference points. The engineers watched her like she was some rare animal. "Can I take the head off?" she asked. "Go ahead," Robert said. Sarah used the tools available on the bench and got to work. Her hands moved with precision, every motion deliberate. She disassembled the head in 15 minutes, examined each part one by one, then pointed to a small sensor attached to the side of the block. "Here's your problem," she said, touching the part. "Bad contact in the coolant temperature sensor. It's sending the wrong data to the ECU. The system thinks the engine is overheating and cuts the power automatically." "That's not possible," the man with glasses muttered. "We tested that sensor 3 times. "You tested it outside the engine," Sarah replied, still looking at the part. "The problem only shows up with vibration. The internal contact is loose." She unplugged the sensor, cleaned the terminals with a small brush, and reconnected everything. Then she reassembled the head just as quickly as she'd taken it apart. "You can test it now," she said, stepping away from the bench. The man with glasses started the engine. The V8 roared smoothly and held a steady idle. He gave it gas. The engine responded instantly. More throttle, full power, no performance drop. Everyone fell silent. Robert looked at Sarah, who was wiping her hands on a borrowed cloth. "You're a genius," he said, genuinely impressed. Sarah looked back at him with a half-smile. "I prefer to be called a mechanic." She returned the tools, waved to the team, and headed for the exit. Robert followed her, still processing what he had just witnessed. "How did you know?" he asked, catching up with her in the hallway. "I listened to the engine," she replied, without stopping. It told me where the problem was. Engines don't talk. Sarah stopped and turned to him. To those who know how to listen, they do. You just have to learn their language. She continued walking toward the exit, leaving Robert standing in the hallway with more questions than answers, and with the absolute certainty that Sarah Barnes was far more than just a small-town mechanic. She was a mystery he had to figure out. Robert Mitchell barely slept that night. The image of Sarah disassembling the engine in 15 minutes while 5 expert engineers just stood there watching in silence played in his mind like a misfiring piston. The next morning, he arrived at the office 2 hours earlier than usual. He sat in a leather chair behind his mahogany desk and began scribbling numbers on a notepad. Base salary, benefits, health plan, profit sharing. What would it take to convince someone like Sarah Barnes to work for him? At 10 a.m., he buzzed Jennifer, his secretary, through the intercom. "Jen, prepare an employment contract. I'll need it this afternoon." "For which position, Mr. Mitchell?" "Senior consulting engineer. Starting salary at $80,000 a year with reviews every 6 months. Jennifer wrote it down but hesitated. "Have you discussed this with HR?" "No need. I'll do the interview myself." At 2 in the afternoon, Robert returned to Barnes & Sons Auto Repair, this time wearing a light blue dress shirt without a tie, trying to appear less formal. Still, he felt out of place in that environment. Sarah was under a black Dodge Ram, only her legs visible. He heard the sound of wrenches and a few muffled words in Spanish, words that likely weren't compliments about the suspension system. "Miss Barnes?" he called. "If this is another test, you can leave," she answered from under the truck. "I've already proven my point. Actually, I came to make an offer." Sarah slid out from under the Dodge, sat on the floor, and looked at him curiously. She had an oil smudge on her left cheek and messy hair. "What kind of offer?" Robert pulled a contract from his blazer's inside pocket and unfolded it carefully. "A job. At Mitchell Automotive Industries, $80,000 a year plus benefits. You'd be our senior consulting engineer." Sarah took the paper and read it quickly, frowning. Then she handed it back to him. "No, thank you." Robert blinked, confused. He had prepared for negotiation, maybe a request for more money, questions about hours, not a simple and direct no. "You didn't even think about it," he said. $80,000 is 4 times more than you probably make here." "So what?" Sarah stood and began wiping her hands on a dirty cloth. "I'm fine here in my dad's shop. He taught me everything. This is where I belong." "Your dad?" Robert looked around. "Where is he?" Sarah pointed to a framed photo on the wall next to a 2019 calendar. The picture showed a middle-aged man smiling in a blue jumpsuit with a wrench in his hand. Below it, a small gold plaque read, "In memory of Edward Barnes, 1965 to 2021. Robert felt a tight knot in his stomach. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "It's okay," Sarah said, returning to the Dodge. "He taught me that a mechanic's place is wherever there's a broken engine. And around here, there's always work." Robert followed her, determined not to give up. "But Sarah, think about it. You work with old tools, the floor is cracked, there's no air conditioning, and the roof leaks in 3 places. So what? You've got too much talent to stay in a place like this. At our company, you'd have modern labs, state-of-the-art equipment, a qualified team." Sarah stopped working on the engine and slowly turned to face him. There was something different in her expression, a mix of sadness and irritation. "Mr. Mitchell, can I ask you a question?" "Of course." "Do you know the difference between an engine and a machine?" Robert hesitated. "Well, technically, an engine is a type of machine." "No," she interrupted. "An engine has a story. It has personality. Every scratch, every strange sound, every vibration tells a story of who drove it, where it went, what it's been through." She pointed to the Dodge Ram. "This one belongs to Jim Morrison." "Not the singer," she smiled. "Jim, the guy who owns a cattle ranch on the other side of town. He bought this pickup in 2003 to drive his youngest daughter to school every day. 17 years later, she became a doctor and moved to Nashville. But Jim still brings it in every month for a tune-up, because that engine holds all their memories." Robert listened silently. "That's where engines have soul," Sarah continued, gesturing toward the garage. "Over at your factory, you just have machines, new parts, computers, efficiency, but no one cares about the story each engine will carry." Sarah, that's romantic, Robert said, trying to sound understanding. But it doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't build a solid future. My dad built this garage with his own hands back in 1987, she said, walking over to the workbench. He paid for the house, raised me by himself after my mom died, taught me everything I know, with engines that had soul, Mr. Mitchell. Not with machines that had no story. Robert stepped up to the bench and noticed an open toolbox. Inside, every wrench, every pair of pliers, every screwdriver was organized with military precision. Some tools were clearly old, their wooden handles worn smooth by use. Were these his? Robert asked, pointing to the tools. Some. Others I made myself, Sarah said, picking up a wrench with a blue-painted handle. I made this one when I was 15. My dad used to say a real mechanic has to know their tools the way a musician knows their instrument. Robert took the wrench. It was heavy, solid, marked with scratches and signs of wear. You made this? I forged it in the shop next door. Mr. Ramirez taught me. It took me 3 weeks, but it came out perfect. Robert handed the tool back, clearly impressed. Sarah, I understand the sentimental value of all this, but imagine what you could do with unlimited resources. Research, development, cutting-edge technology. For what? She asked, closing the toolbox. To build more efficient engines? Cleaner ones? Quieter ones? Yes, to make people's lives better. Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. Mr. Mitchell, do you know why I fixed your Chevelle in 10 minutes? Because you're talented. Because I listened. I lay down under it, put my hand on the engine, and listened to what it was trying to tell me. At your factory, no one listens. You measure, calculate, run tests, but no one stops to ask, what does this engine need to feel alive? Robert frowned. Engines don't feel alive, Sarah. They're machines. Exactly, she said, picking up a screwdriver and heading back to the Dodge. That's exactly what I'm talking about. She disappeared under the car again. Robert stood there, holding the rejected contract, trying to make sense of the conversation. Sarah, Mr. Mitchell, she interrupted, her voice muffled. You're a smart man. You have a successful company, money, prestige, but I bet it's been years since you touched a real engine, since you felt the heat of the metal, since you heard the growl of a finely tuned V8. Robert opened his mouth to argue, but realized she was right. When was the last time he worked with his hands? When was the last time he got grease under his nails? Your offer is generous, Sarah continued. But I don't want a job where engines are just numbers in a spreadsheet. I want to stay here, where they can be themselves. Robert folded the contract and slipped it into his pocket. Can I ask you something? He said. Go ahead. Aren't you afraid of being left behind, of missing out on opportunities? Sarah slid out from under the car again and sat on the floor, looking straight at him. Mr. Mitchell, you may have modern labs and expensive equipment, but I have something money can't buy. What's that? I know how to make an engine sing. She stood up, grabbed the Dodge's keys, and started the engine. The sound was perfect, smooth, powerful, balanced. Hear that? She said, revving it up. That's music. That's soul. Robert listened, and for the first time in years he realized he wasn't just hearing noise. He was truly listening to an engine. Sarah shut off the motor and turned to him. Your offer is tempting, Mr. Mitchell, but I'd rather stay here where I can teach engines how to sing. She walked back to the workbench, making it clear the conversation was over. Robert headed for the exit, confused and slightly offended. No one had ever turned him down like that before. No one had ever questioned his values and priorities so simply. But as he walked toward the Chevelle, he couldn't get the sound of the Dodge's engine out of his head. And for the first time in a long while, he asked himself, when was the last time he had made something sing? The following Monday, Robert Mitchell showed up at Barnes & Sons Auto Repair at 10 in the morning with a question about carburetors and classic engines. On Tuesday, he came back asking about electronic ignition systems versus breaker points. On Wednesday, he wanted to know the difference between synthetic and mineral oil in old engines. By Thursday, Sarah was getting suspicious. Mr. Mitchell, she said, stepping out from under a red 1965 Mustang, don't you have a whole team of engineers to answer these questions? Robert straightened his tie, a little embarrassed. I do, but I like hearing different opinions, different perspectives. Uh-huh. Sarah grabbed a rag and started wiping her hands slowly, clearly amused. And these different perspectives don't exist in Nashville, only here in Brentwood? Well, you have a unique approach. Robert stayed there in the middle of the garage watching Sarah work. It was strange how comfortable he felt in that place, despite the organized mess, the smell of oil, and the country music playing from an old radio in the corner. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "You can, but if it's about engines, I charge for consulting." "It's not about engines, it's about you." Sarah stopped wiping her hands and looked at him. "About me? How did you learn all this? I mean, you know more than a lot of engineers I've met." Sarah smiled and walked over to the tool bench. "My dad, he taught me since I was a kid. I was 6 when I started handing him tools. By 10, I could do an oil change on my own. At 15, I was tearing down full engines. And school? College? I finished high school. After that, my dad got sick. Cancer. I had to take over the shop." Robert felt a tightness in his chest. "I'm sorry." "No need. He lived well, passed away in peace, and he left me the best inheritance I could ask for, knowledge." Robert looked around the shop with new eyes. Every tool hanging on the wall, every manual stacked on the shelf, every old but well-kept machine. It all told a story of dedication and love. "Was your dad always a mechanic?" "Since he was 16. Started out as an apprentice in a shop in Memphis. Then he came here, worked for others until he saved enough to open his own place." "And he never wanted to do something else?" Sarah shrugged. "Never thought about it. I always knew this would be my place." "Don't you ever get curious about the world out there? Other cities? Other countries?" "Of course I do, but I don't need to leave to see the world." She pointed at the cars in the shop. "Every engine that comes through here brings stories from different places. That Mustang came from Detroit, that pickup's from Texas. That Corolla belongs to a Japanese family that moved here 5 years ago." Robert had never looked at it that way. "That's an interesting perspective. It's real life, Mr. Mitchell, not just perspective." On Friday, Robert showed up with no technical questions. He just stood there watching Sarah work on a 1969 Camaro with transmission issues. "Don't you have a company to run today?" she asked, not looking away from the car. "I do, but I delegated some tasks." "First time?" "What do you mean?" "First time you've delegated. I bet you're one of those bosses who wants to control everything." Robert laughed, surprised at how accurate that was. "How can you tell?" "The way you talk. Always so serious, so formal. A man who doesn't trust others to do the job right." "It's not that I don't trust." "Yes, it is." Sarah smiled. "But it's okay. I'm the same way with my engines." Robert spent the rest of the morning watching Sarah work. There was something almost hypnotic in the way she moved, how her hands always found the right tool without looking, how she could diagnose a problem just by listening. "Can I try?" he asked suddenly. "Try what?" "Helping. Handing you tools I don't know." Sarah looked him up and down. "In that outfit?" Robert looked at his gray suit and silk tie. "I can take off the jacket. And the tie. And the tie. And those Italian shoes." Robert hesitated. "The shoes too? Mr. Mitchell, this floor's covered in oil. You'll slip and crack your head open. Or worse, you'll mess up my clean floor with blood." Robert laughed and took off the shoes, standing there in just his socks. "There, now can I help?" Sarah studied him for a second, amused. "Trying to become an intern?" "Maybe. All right then. Grab that 15mm wrench." Robert looked at the tool bench, totally lost. There were dozens of wrenches, all different sizes. "This one?" he asked, picking one at random. "That's a 12. The 15 is the third from the left." Robert grabbed the right tool and handed it to Sarah. "Thanks. Now hold this hose while I tighten the connection." They worked together for about an hour. Robert was clumsy but trying his best. Sarah was patient, though she didn't hold back her sarcastic comments about his lack of practical skills. "For an engineer, you're pretty bad with your hands," she said as Robert dropped a screwdriver for the 3rd time. "It's been a while since I worked directly with tools." "How long?" Robert thought for a moment. "About 15 years?" 15 years? Sarah stopped what she was doing. "You haven't touched an engine in 15 years? I've had other responsibilities." "Like what?" "Management, strategic planning, meetings with investors. Important stuff." "It is important." "More important than this?" She pointed at the Camaro's engine. Robert didn't know how to answer. At that moment, a boy around 12 appeared at the entrance of the garage. He was thin, with messy brown hair and clothes that were clearly not new. He had a school backpack on and a big smile on his face. "Hi, Sarah," he called out, running toward them. "Hey, Chewy." Sarah opened her arms for a hug. "How was school?" "Boring. The math teacher gave us weekend homework. Tough life." The boy noticed Robert and frowned. "Who's this guy in a tie?" "This is Mr. Mitchell." "Mr. Mitchell, this is Chewy. He helps me here in the shop after school." Robert waved to the boy. "Hello, Chewy." "Hi." Chewy looked him over from head to toe. "Why aren't you wearing shoes?" "He was helping me," Sarah explained. "Helping?" Chewy laughed. "Men in suits don't know how to work on engines." "Chewy," Sarah scolded. "What? It's true. Suit guys only know how to talk. They don't know how to do stuff." Robert felt his face get hot, but he had to admit the boy had a point. "Do you live nearby, Chewy?" he asked, trying to change the subject. "I live at the Methodist Church orphanage. It's 3 blocks from here." "Oh. My parents died in a car crash when I was 8. I live there now." Robert didn't know what to say. The way the boy talked about his own tragedies so naturally left him speechless. "Chewy comes here every day after school," Sarah explained. "He's my official assistant." "Assistant?" Chewy stood taller, proud. "I'm a small engine specialist. Lawnmowers, chainsaws, stuff like that." "That's impressive," Robert said sincerely. "What do you do?" Chewy asked. "I'm an engineer. I own a company that makes engines." "Big engines?" "Yes, for new cars." "Oh," Chewy looked a bit disappointed. "New engines are boring. They don't have any personality." Robert glanced at Sarah, who was trying not to laugh. "Why do you say that?" "Because they're all the same," Chewy explained like it was obvious. "Old engines are different. Each one has its own way, its own mood. This Camaro here, for example, he likes to accelerate slowly. If you try too fast, he stalls." "How do you know that?" "Sarah taught me. She knows how to talk to engines." Robert spent the rest of the afternoon watching Sarah and Chewy work together. It was clear she had become a mother figure to the boy. She taught him with patience, corrected him gently, and protected him with fierce instinct. Sarah's a good cook too, sitting on a tall stool next to the workbench. She makes the best grilled cheese sandwich in Tennessee. "Chewy, stop telling Mr. Mitchell my life story," Sarah said, embarrassed. "Why? He seems nice. Kind of clumsy, but nice." Robert laughed. "Thanks, I think." "Sarah should date someone," Chewy went on, ignoring the death stare she gave him. "She works too much. She never goes out, never has fun." "Chewy, what? It's true, the last time you went out was 6 months ago for Mrs. Maria's birthday." "That's none of Mr. Mitchell's business." "Of course it is," Chewy said, turning to Robert with a cheeky grin. "I bet the guy with the fancy car is in love with Sarah." Robert almost choked. What? No, Look how red he got," Chewy yelled, laughing. "I knew it." "Chewy, stop it," Sarah said, though she was laughing too. "The fancy car guy's in love, Sarah. That's why he comes here every day pretending he has questions." Robert's face burned. The boy's observation was embarrassingly accurate. I have to go," he stammered, grabbing his shoes quickly. "He's running away," Chewy shouted. "That proves it." Robert said goodbye quickly and practically ran to the Chevelle. As he drove back home, he couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's laugh and the boy's words. Was it really that obvious? Had Sarah noticed? And more importantly, what was he going to do about it? Because for the first time in years, Robert Mitchell had to admit that a 12-year-old orphan was absolutely right. He was in love. Robert Mitchell spent the weekend trying not to think about Sarah Barnes. He tried to focus on financial reports, production spreadsheets, anything that could keep him busy. But every time he started the Chevelle, the smooth sound of the engine reminded him of her hands adjusting the ignition, the confidence in her movements, the way she talked to engines like they were old friends. And Chewy's words kept echoing in his mind. The guy with the fancy car is in love. On Monday morning, he walked into his office determined to forget about Barnes Auto and focus on what really mattered. Business. He had a meeting with investors at 10, a conference call with the development team at 2, and a stack of contracts waiting for his signature. But the moment he sat down and turned on his computer, his mind went back to Sarah saying his company only had machines, no engines with soul. The comment had struck a nerve, something deeper he didn't want to admit. At 9 in the morning, instead of reviewing the investor presentation, Robert found himself walking through the company hallways toward the basement archive. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he had a strange feeling, like there was something important he'd missed. The archive at Mitchell Automotive Industries filled a massive room in the basement of the main building. Metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, hacked with boxes sorted by year and department. Robert rarely went down there. Why bother with old paperwork when he had assistants for that? But today was different. He started with the boxes from the 1980s, when his father was still running the company. Gerald Mitchell had been a practical man, focused on results, who had turned a small family shop into a multi-million-dollar business. Robert had always admired him for that. The first box held supplier contracts, faded invoices, and company correspondence. Nothing interesting. The second had sales reports and market analysis. Still nothing. It was in the third box that he found it. Between a folder of registered patents and another of shelved projects, there was a thick manila envelope with a handwritten label, Barnes Project, 1987-1989, confidential. Robert's heart started racing. Barnes, same last name as Sarah. He opened the envelope carefully and pulled out a stack of documents. On the first page, a detailed technical design for a new type of carburetor, signed John E. Barnes, technical consultant. Date, March 15, 1987. Robert recognized the design immediately. It was the foundation of the electronic injection system that Mitchell Automotive had patented in 1990, and that went on to become one of the company's most profitable products in the years that followed. He kept flipping through the documents, more designs, more innovations, all signed by John Barnes. A more efficient cooling system, a valve configuration that reduced fuel consumption by 15%, improvements in the transmission system that increased engine durability. Every one of these ideas had later been developed and patented by Mitchell Automotive. Everyone had brought in millions in profits over the years. But nowhere did Robert find John Barnes's name on the official patent records. At the bottom of the envelope, he found a letter, dated December 10, 1989, addressed to Gerald Mitchell, signed by John Barnes. Mr. Mitchell, as we discussed yesterday, I confirm that I will no longer be able to provide consulting services to your company. Personal circumstances are forcing me to leave Nashville, making it impossible to continue our partnership. Thank you for the opportunity, and I trust that the projects I developed over the last 2 years will be useful for the growth of Mitchell Automotive. Sincerely, John Edward Barnes. Robert read the letter 3 times. John Barnes had left Nashville in 1989. Sarah had said her father moved to Brentwood and opened his own shop. The dates matched exactly. But something about the letter felt off. The tone was formal, almost cold, as if John Barnes had been forced to write it. Robert dug deeper and found a separate folder with handwritten notes from his father. The handwriting was hard to read, but a few lines stood out. Barnes wants public credit for the innovations. Explain that consulting work is confidential by nature. Increase payment if necessary to ensure secrecy. If he doesn't agree to the terms, consider terminating the contract. Robert felt his stomach turn. Slowly, the situation was becoming clear. John Barnes had developed groundbreaking innovations for the company. He wanted public recognition for his work. Gerald Mitchell had refused, probably to keep full control over the patents and profits. John Barnes had been forced to choose between well-paid anonymity and his professional integrity. And he had chosen his integrity. Robert kept digging and found more documents, confidentiality agreements signed by John Barnes, intellectual property transfer agreements, clauses giving Mitchell Automotive exclusive rights to any innovation developed during the consulting period. All perfectly legal, all completely unethical. His father had bought John Barnes' talent and then erased his name from the story. Robert went up to his office in shock. He canceled the meeting with the investors, locked the door, and stared out the window without seeing anything. His company, his fortune, his reputation, all built on the work of a man who had never received the credit he deserved. And that man was the father of the woman he was falling in love with. The irony was too cruel to be a coincidence. At 2 p.m, Robert was back in the archives, this time with Jennifer, his secretary, who helped him locate all documents related to the Barnes project. There was much more material than he had expected. Mr. Mitchell, said Jennifer, flipping through a patent folder. How many millions did these projects bring in for the company? Robert did a quick mental calculation. About 200 million over the past 30 years. And this John Barnes never received any royalties? Apparently not. Jennifer let out a low whistle. That's complicated. That's putting it mildly. Robert spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing every document, every contract, every note. The more he read, the less he admired his father, and the more guilty he felt. John Barnes had been a genius. His innovations were decades ahead of their time. If he had received the credit he deserved, he'd be recognized today as one of the great pioneers in American automotive engineering. Instead, he had died in anonymity, running a small garage in Brentwood, Tennessee, and his daughter believed Mitchell Automotive was just a soulless machine factory. If she only knew the truth. Robert pictured Sarah's reaction when she found out that the company trying to recruit her was the same one that had stolen her father's legacy. The anger, the disappointment, the sense of betrayal. She would never forgive him. At 6 p.m, Robert was sitting in his office, surrounded by documents spread across his desk, when his phone rang. Robert? It was the voice of his uncle Harold, Gerald Mitchell's younger brother, and the company's current vice president. Jennifer said you canceled all your meetings today. Is everything okay? Harold, I need to talk to you. Can you come to my office? Of course, I'll be there in 10 minutes. Harold Mitchell was a 60-year-old man, bald, with a neatly trimmed gray mustache and the same serious posture as Gerald. He had worked alongside his brother for over 40 years and knew all the company's secrets. What are all these papers? Harold asked, sitting in the chair across from Robert's desk. Documents from the Barnes project, from 1987 to 1989. Harold's face tensed up immediately. Why are you digging into that? Because I met John Barnes's daughter, and I found out that my father basically stole his work. Harold let out a deep sigh. Robert, your father was a businessman. He did what was necessary to protect the company. Protect the company? Uncle Harold. John Barnes developed innovations that earned us 200 million in profits, and he never got a dime in royalties. He was paid for his consulting services, which is nothing compared to what his work brought in for us. Harold stood and walked over to the window. Robert, you don't understand how things worked in the 80s. The competition was brutal. If we had given Barnes public credit, other companies would have tried to hire him. We could have lost our competitive edge. So instead, we destroyed his career? We didn't destroy anything. He chose to walk away, after you refused to give him the credit he deserved. Harold returned to the chair, clearly uncomfortable. Robert, that was more than 30 years ago. Why are you bringing this up now? Robert picked up the photo of John Barnes he had found in the files. A middle-aged man, smiling, wearing a blue jumpsuit and holding a wrench. The same photo he had seen on the wall of Sarah's garage. Because it's not fair, Uncle Harold, and because apparently I'm the only person in this company who cares about it. Harold looked at his nephew for a long moment. You're in love with his daughter, aren't you? Robert didn't answer, but his expression said it all. Oh, Robert? Harold shook his head. That really complicates things. It only complicates things because we did something wrong 30 years ago and never fixed it. And what do you plan to do? Give John Barnes posthumous credit? Pay back royalties to his daughter? Publish an apology in the newspaper? Robert hadn't thought of any specific solutions. He just knew he couldn't live with that weight on his conscience. I don't know yet, but I have to do something. Harold got up to leave. Be careful, Robert. Sometimes trying to fix past mistakes just creates bigger problems in the present. After Harold left, Robert sat alone in his office, staring at the photo of John Barnes. Behind the smile, he now saw the frustration of a talented man who never got the recognition he deserved. And behind his own reflection in the window, he saw a man who had just discovered his fortune was built on injustice. The question was, what was he going to do about it? And more importantly, would he be able to look Sarah in the eyes again, knowing what he knew? Robert picked up the phone and dialed the number for Barnes's garage. When Sarah answered, he almost hung up. Hello? Sarah, this is Robert Mitchell. Hi, Mr. Mitchell. Is there a problem with the Chevelle? No, I need to talk to you. It's important. Go ahead. Not on the phone. Can I come by tomorrow? Sure, but if it's to offer me a job again. It's not that. It's about your father. Silence on the other end. My father? What about him? I'll explain tomorrow. Sarah, your father was an extraordinary man. I know that, Mr. Mitchell. No, you don't know everything. And Robert hung up, knowing he had just started a conversation that would change everything between them, for better or worse. Robert Mitchell didn't sleep that night. He stayed awake until 3 a.m, sitting in his living room in Belmead, with a pile of documents on the coffee table and an impossible decision ahead. How could he tell Sarah that his company had taken credit for her father's work? How could he explain that the millions he inherited were partly the result of John Barnes's unrecognized talent? At 6 a.m, he gave up trying to sleep. He took a shower, put on a blue polo shirt and jeans, no suit today, and drove downtown Nashville. He had a mission. His first stop was Hatch Show Print, a historic print shop on Broadway that had been doing handcrafted work since 1879. Robert explained what he wanted to the owner: restore an old technical manual and engrave a name on the leather cover. How long will it take? Robert asked. For a job like this, usually about a week, the craftsman replied, a gray-bearded man who carefully examined the manual. I need it today. I'll pay whatever it takes. The man raised an eyebrow. That must be very important. It is. It'll cost 3 times the normal price. That's okay. At 10 a.m, Robert was at Vanderbilt University in the engineering library looking for information about automotive innovations from the 1980s. He wanted to better understand the historical context of John Barnes's projects, the importance of his contributions to the industry. What he found impressed him even more. John Barnes' innovations weren't just good. They were revolutionary. The electronic fuel injection system he developed was years ahead of competitors. Some of the solutions he proposed were only adopted by the German industry in the late 1990s. John Barnes wasn't just a talented mechanic. He was a visionary. At 2 p.m, Robert returned to the print shop. The manual was transformed. The leather cover, once worn and stained, now shined with a professional finish. On the front, engraved in elegant gold letters, it read, Automotive Innovations Manual, John Edward Barnes, Pioneer and Visionary, 1955 to 2021. It looks perfect, Robert said, paying the bill. I hope the person appreciates it, the craftsman replied. I hope so, too. At 3 p.m, Robert parked in front of Barnes & Sons Auto Repair. He took a deep breath, grabbed the manual wrapped in blue gift paper, and went inside the garage. Sarah was under a red Jeep Cherokee, only her legs visible. Chu sat on a stool beside her, handing her tools. Hi, Mr. Mitchell, Chu shouted when he saw him. No suit today. Hi, Chewy. Thought this would be more practical. Sarah slid out from under the Jeep and sat on the floor, looking at Robert with curiosity. You said you wanted to talk about my father. Yes. Robert held the package tighter. But first, I brought something for you. Sarah frowned. A gift? Kind of. He held out the package. Sarah hesitated before taking it, looking a little unsure. She carefully opened the paper, and her eyes widened when she saw the restored manual. Where did you get this? I found it in my company's archives. I thought you might want to have it. Sarah opened the manual and flipped through the pages. They were detailed technical projects, complex diagrams, handwritten notes in her father's careful handwriting. Things she had never seen before. I didn't know he did all this, she murmured, gently touching one of the pages. Sarah, your father was a genius. These innovations, they changed the automotive industry. She kept flipping, and Robert saw tears welling in her eyes. Why do you have this? She finally asked. Robert swallowed hard. It was time for the truth. Because my company, because my father. He stopped, searching for the right words. Sarah, your father worked as a consultant for Mitchell Automotive between 1987 and 1989. She looked at him, confused. A consultant? He developed several projects for us, innovations that became very profitable. And Robert felt sweat running down his back, and he never got the public credit he deserved. My father wanted to keep the authorship secret. Sarah slowly closed the manual. Go on. When your father asked for recognition for his work, my father refused, said consulting work was confidential by nature. Your father, he chose to leave instead of accepting the anonymity. Sarah stood slowly, holding the manual to her chest. You're telling me your company stole my father's work? It wasn't theft, technically. There were contracts, legal clauses. Contracts you forced him to sign? Robert couldn't answer. Sarah walked over to the tool bench and carefully placed the manual on it. How much money did your company make from his work? Sarah, how much? About 200 million in the last 30 years. She closed her eyes for a moment. 200 million. Yes. And my father died owning a small garage, struggling to pay the medical bills for his cancer treatment. Robert felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Sarah, I didn't know. You didn't know? She turned to him, eyes shining with anger. You own the company. How did you not know? I found out yesterday. That's why I called you. I wanted to explain. Explain? Sarah grabbed the manual and handed it back to him. You want to clear your guilt with gifts? That's not it. It is. You found out your fortune was built on my father's work, and now you want to feel better by giving pretty presents to the orphaned daughter. Sarah, please let me explain. Explain what? That you destroyed my father's career? That he could have been recognized as the inventor he really was, but you preferred to keep the credit for yourselves? Robert tried to step closer, but she backed away. Sarah? Do you know why my father opened this garage? She gestured around. Because after he left your company, no one else wanted to hire him. There was a rumor that he was difficult to work with, that he made unreasonable demands. That's not true. Isn't it? Then why did he spend the last 30 years of his life fixing old cars instead of developing innovations that could have changed the industry? Robert had no answer for that. Sarah, I want to fix this. We can give your father public credit, pay back royalties. With what right? She interrupted. You stole 30 years of his life. You think money can make up for that? It's a start. It's an insult. Chewy, who had been quietly watching, stepped closer to them. Sarah, he said, gently touching her arm, maybe Mr. Mitchell is trying to do the right thing. Chewy, you don't understand. I do. My parents were stolen from too. The man who hit their car was drunk, but he had an expensive lawyer. He was never arrested. He never paid me anything. Sarah looked at the boy, surprised. But you know what the difference is? Chewy continued. That man never tried to find me to say sorry, never wanted to make it right. Mr. Mitchell is at least trying. Chewy? Sarah, you always tell me people deserve a second chance, that every engine can be fixed if someone has patience to listen to what's wrong. Robert looked at the boy gratefully. Thank you, Chewy. Don't thank me yet, Chewy said, turning to Robert. Sarah has every right to be angry. You did a very bad thing to Mr. Barnes. I know. But arguing won't bring him back, and getting angry won't fix the past. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Chewy, you're too young to understand these things. I'm young, but I'm not dumb. He walked over to the tool bench and grabbed a wrench with a red ribbon tied to the handle. Mr. Mitchell, Sarah only trusts people who build things together. Robert took the wrench, confused. What do you mean? It's no use just saying you want to fix things. You have to show it. You have to get your hands dirty. You have to build something new together with her. Sarah looked at Chewy, then at Robert, then at the wrench in her hands. Chewy, you can't just... Yes, I can. You always say broken engines can be fixed. People can be fixed too. Robert held the wrench carefully, as if it were something sacred. What do you want me to do, Sarah? She stared at him for a long moment. First, stop calling me Sarah. We're not friends. How should I call you? Miss Barnes. Like always. All right, Miss Barnes. Second, take your present away. I don't want anything from your company. Robert looked at the restored manual, then at Chewy, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. What if I leave it here, but not as a gift, like a loan? What do you mean? You keep the manual here at the shop. Study your father's projects. But it still belongs to Mitchell Automotive until we decide together what to do with it. Sarah thought for a moment. And what do you expect in return? Robert looked at the wrench in his hands. A chance to build something together. A chance to fix what my father broke. And how do you plan to do that? I don't know yet, but I know I can't do it alone. I need your help. Sarah took the manual back and put it on the bench. Mr. Mitchell, you destroyed my father's life. This isn't a charity project that's going to fix it. I know, but it's a start. It's a pathetic start. Then teach me how to do better. Sarah studied him silently for almost a minute. Why would I do that? Robert lifted the wrench with the red ribbon. Because, according to Chewy, you believe broken engines can be fixed. And I'm the most broken engine you've ever seen. Despite everything, Sarah almost smiled. You really are pathetic, Mr. Mitchell. Yes, I am. And arrogant. Also, and completely out of touch with reality. True. Sarah looked at Chewy, who was watching the conversation with interest. And you think I should help this man? I think you should give him a chance to show who he really is, Chewy replied. Not who his father was, not who his company is, who he is. Sarah sighed deeply. One chance, Mr. Mitchell. One single chance. If you disappoint me, if you try to buy me off with expensive gifts or generous offers, it's over. Understand? I understand. And don't come here every day pretending to have technical questions. If you want to talk, be honest. I will. And stop wearing a tie. Around here, we work. We don't have meetings. Robert smiled. You got it. Sarah took the wrench back. Now go. I have work to do. Can I come back tomorrow? You can. But come ready to really work. No just standing around watching. Robert waved to Chewy and headed for the door. At the door, he turned back. Miss Barnes? What? Thank you for the chance. Don't thank me yet, Mr. Mitchell. You have no idea what you're getting into. As he drove home, Robert looked down at his own hands on the wheel. Soft hands, no calluses, that hadn't touched tools in 15 years. Tomorrow that would change. Tomorrow, he would start learning the difference between machines and engines with soul. And maybe, with a lot of luck and hard work, he could fix more than just engines. Robert Mitchell arrived at Barnes & Sons Auto Repair the next morning at 7:30, half an hour before the shop opened. He wore faded jeans, a simple gray t-shirt, and old sneakers he'd found at the back of his closet, clothes he hadn't worn in at least 10 years. Sarah was already there, of course. She always arrived early. She was organizing tools at the main bench, with a steaming cup of coffee nearby. Good morning, Miss Barnes, he said, trying to sound casual. Mr. Mitchell? She looked him up and down. At least today, you don't look like you're headed to a business meeting. I thought this would be more appropriate. It's a start. Sarah finished organizing the tools and turned to him. Before we start anything, I need to know one thing. When was the last time you really worked with your hands? And I'm not talking about tightening a few screws for 5 minutes to impress visitors at the factory. Robert thought for a moment. Probably in college. I had a practical engines class in my second year. How long ago was that? 15 years. Sarah shook her head. 15 years. Mr. Mitchell, you've been running an engine company for a decade and haven't worked with an engine in 15 years? I have other responsibilities. Of course you do. She took a sip of her coffee. All right, let's see if you still remember anything. Sarah walked over to a corner of the shop where several engine parts were spread out on a blue tarp. Pistons, valves, crankshafts, cylinder heads, all clean and organized but clearly taken apart. This was the engine from a 1965 Mustang that came in last month, she explained. The owner gave up on fixing it because he thought it would be too expensive. I bought the parts. Robert bent down to examine the components. It's in good shape. For someone who hasn't touched an engine in 15 years, you sound pretty confident. Theory, remember? Oh, right. Theory. Sarah smiled in a way that wasn't exactly friendly. Let's see your theory in practice. We're going to rebuild this engine. Together. Really? Mr. Mitchell, you said you wanted to build something with me. This is your test. If we can get this engine running, maybe you'll prove you really want to fix things between your family and mine. Robert looked at the parts on the floor. There were a lot of components, lots of screws, lots of chances to mess up. What if I break something? Then you find out if you really have enough money to pay for the damage. Just then, Chewy came back from school carrying his backpack. Hi, Sarah. Hi, Mr. Mitchell. He shouted, running up to them. Are you going to build an engine? We're going to try, Sarah replied. Can I help? You have school, but I can come here at lunch and after classes. You can, but now, go study. Chewy ran off, clearly excited at the idea of watching Robert struggle with tools. Sarah grabbed a technical manual and put it on a makeshift table made from a box. First, let's review the theory. Show me you at least remember how an engine works. Robert studied the diagram in the manual and began explaining the 4-stroke cycle. Intake, compression, combustion, exhaust. Sarah listened quietly, occasionally asking more detailed technical questions. "Your theory is correct," she said finally. "Now let's see if your hands can keep up with your head." They started with the engine block. Sarah showed Robert how to check if the surfaces were clean and level, how to apply sealant on the gaskets, how to place the parts in the right order. Robert tried to follow the instructions, but his hands didn't cooperate. He dropped screws, put too much sealant in some places and too little in others, and took 3 tries to fit a simple head gasket correctly. "You're nervous," Sarah noted. "A little." "Why? It's just an engine." "It's just been a long time, and you're watching every move I make." "Mr. Mitchell, if you can't work with someone watching, you'll never work with me." Robert took a deep breath and tried to focus. Slowly his movements became more coordinated, not skilled, but at least functional. When they got to the pistons, Robert finally got one fitted right on the first try. "Getting better," Sarah said. "But you're still too tense. Relax. I'm trying." "No, you're not. You're overthinking it. An engine isn't math, Mr. Mitchell. It's instinct." Robert looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "Feel this bolt." She took his hand and placed it on a bolt he was trying to tighten. "Feel the resistance? When does it stop turning easily?" "I feel it." "That's the point. You don't need a torque wrench to know when it's tight enough. Your hand knows. And what if I tighten too much?" "Then you learn not to tighten too much next time." Robert tried to follow her philosophy. Instead of calculating the force mentally, he tried to feel what the bolt was telling him. It worked better than he expected. "You're starting to get it," Sarah said, watching him work. They spent the whole morning assembling the engine. Sarah was a tough but fair teacher. She corrected Robert's mistakes without embarrassing him, but didn't accept sloppy work either. "Again," she said when Robert tried to install a valve without checking if the surface was completely clean. "But it's almost clean." "Almost doesn't count." Again. Robert removed the valve, cleaned everything again, and reinstalled it. This time it was perfect. "Better," Sarah said. At lunchtime, Chewy showed up as promised, bringing sandwiches for all 3 of them. "How's it going?" he asked, sitting on the floor beside them. "Your friend here knows theory but has office hands," Sarah said, biting into her sandwich. Robert laughed. "Thanks for the encouragement." "It's true," Sarah insisted, but she was smiling. "You think too much. You want to calculate everything. Engines don't work like that." "How do they work then?" "You talk to them, listen to what they need, feel where the problem is." "Engines don't talk, Miss Barnes." "They do. You just haven't learned their language yet." Chewy laughed. "Sarah's right. I've seen her talk to engines. Sometimes they answer." "That's not crazy," Sarah said seriously. "It's experience. When you work with engines for 20 years, you learn to recognize every sound, every vibration, every sign they give." Robert looked at her hands, stained with grease, with small cuts and calluses from years of work. "You like this, don't you?" "Manual work. I like the feeling of fixing something that was broken, giving new life to something everyone thought was junk." "Is it satisfying?" "More than any corporate meeting you've ever had, I bet." Robert couldn't disagree. In the afternoon, when Shui got back from school, they were finishing up the assembly. The engine was almost done, just a few final adjustments and the electrical systems to connect. "Can I start it?" Robert asked. "Not yet. First we have to check everything." Twice, Sarah guided him through a careful inspection. They checked all the bolts were tightened correctly, all connections were secure, and all fluids were at the right levels. "Now you can try," she said finally. Robert turned the ignition key. The engine coughed once, made a strange noise, and died. "What was that?" he asked, worried. "Calm down. The first try rarely works." Sarah opened the hood and checked some connections. "Here, this hose was loose." On the second try, the engine started. It wasn't a perfect roar, but it was running. "We did it!" Chui shouted, jumping for joy. Robert smiled, surprisingly moved. It was just an old engine, but it was something he built with his own hands, for the first time in 15 years. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked. "Good. Really good, actually." "Different from signing contracts?" "Completely different." Sarah turned off the engine and closed the hood. "Mr. Mitchell, we still have a lot of work ahead. This engine runs, but it's not perfect. It'll need adjustments and improvements." "Like our situation." "Exactly." She looked him straight in the eye. Today you proved you can get your hands dirty. You can listen to instructions and follow directions. That's a start. Only a start? Mr. Mitchell, you've been away from real engines for 15 years. One day's work won't make up for that. But today you showed you have potential, if you want to keep learning. Robert looked at his grease-stained hands, the tools spread around the engine they had built together. I want to keep going. Even knowing it's going to be hard? That I won't go easy on you? Especially because of that. Sarah smiled, the first real smile she had given him. Then we'll be back tomorrow. We'll tune this engine until it sings. And after that? Then we'll see if you really learned anything about engines with soul. As they cleaned the tools, Chewie came up to Robert. Mr. Mitchell, can I ask you something? Of course. Why do you want so badly to impress Sarah? Robert stopped cleaning the wrench he was holding. It's not about impressing, Chewie. It's fixing something that was broken. The engine? Among other things. Chewie nodded as if he understood perfectly. Like my dad always said, the best things in life need to be built slowly, with patience. Your dad was a wise man. He was. I think you two will be friends. Friends? You and Sarah, after you finish fixing each other. Robert looked at Sarah, who was organizing tools on the bench. She worked with economy of movement, every gesture precise and necessary. There was a grace in her skill that he had never noticed in anyone else. I hope so, Chewie. It will be. Broken engines can always be fixed. People too. When Robert left the shop that afternoon, his hands were dirty, his back ached, and he was more tired than after any day in the office. But he was also more satisfied than he had felt in years. For the first time since discovering the truth about John Barnes, he felt he might really be able to fix things, one bolt at a time. 3 weeks later, Robert Mitchell had become a regular at Barnes & Sons Auto Repair. Every day at 7 in the morning, he parked his Chevelle in front of the shop and spent the next 8 hours learning everything Sarah was willing to teach. And she taught a lot. Robert now knew how to tell the difference between the sound of a poorly tuned engine and one that just needed fresh oil. He could change brake pads without needing step-by-step instructions. His hands had developed calluses, and his back had gotten used to bending under hoods. More importantly, he was starting to understand what Sarah meant when she talked about engines with soul. That Friday, Chewie came home from school carrying a cardboard box. "Look what I brought," he shouted, setting the box down on the workbench. "What's that?" Sarah asked, wiping her hands on a rag. "My old radio. I found it in the church storage. Thought it would be nice to have some music here in the shop." Robert looked at the device. It was a 1990s boombox with a telescopic antenna and buttons worn from use. "Does it work?" he asked. "Let's find out," Chewie said, plugging it into the nearest outlet. The radio came to life with a soft static, then caught a country station. Johnny Cash's voice filled the shop with Ring of Fire. "Perfect," Chewie exclaimed, turning up the volume. Sarah smiled. "It's been a while since we had music here." "Your dad didn't like music?" Robert asked. "He did, but after he got sick, I don't know, it stopped making sense to have music playing." Robert understood. Some things lose their meaning when tied to sad memories. "But now it makes sense again," Chewie said, dancing alone to the music. Sarah laughed at the boy's performance and went back to the engine she was working on, a Ford F-150 with transmission problems. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "can you help me with this? I need someone to hold this part while I tighten the bolts." Robert stepped forward and held the part in place. They worked in perfect sync, Sarah guiding and Robert following her instructions. The country music created a relaxed atmosphere Robert had never experienced in a work setting before. "You know," he said, watching Sarah work, "I never thought work could be fun." Fun? Relaxing. Satisfying. I don't know, different. Sarah stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "Mr. Mitchell, what was your work like before?" "Meetings. Lots of meetings. Report analysis, budget approvals, investor conferences." "Sounds boring." "It was, but I thought it was important." "And now?" Robert thought for a moment. "Now I realize there's a difference between important work and work that makes sense." Sarah smiled and went back to the transmission. They worked in silence for a few minutes, listening to the music and occasionally laughing at Chewie's comments. He had named himself the shop's official DJ. That's when Robert noticed the shop sign. The sign on the front of the building was faded, with some letters peeling. Barnes & Sons Auto Repair was still readable, but barely. That sign needs a new paint job, he said. Sarah followed his gaze. I know. It's been on my to-do list for about 2 years. Why haven't you done it yet? Time, money, priorities. Robert studied the sign more closely. The structure was solid, it just needed fresh paint. I can paint it for you. Mr. Mitchell, you know how to paint? Can't be too different from assembling an engine, right? Instruction, patience, attention to detail. Sarah laughed. Painting is very different from mechanics. Then you teach me. I don't know how to paint signs. Then we learn together. Chewy, who had been listening, shouted from across the shop, I know how to paint. My art teacher showed me. Chewy, a shop sign is different from school drawings, Sarah said. But it's just paint and brush, right? And I have a steady hand. Robert looked at Sarah. How about we try it on Saturday? I'll buy the paint. You and Chewy provide the artistic skills. Sarah hesitated. Mr. Mitchell, you don't have to keep spending money here. It's not spending, it's investing. Investing in what? Robert felt his face warm. In doing things right? Sarah studied him for a moment. Okay, Saturday we paint the sign. On Saturday morning, Robert arrived at the shop carrying cans of paint, brushes, rollers, and everything else the hardware store clerk had recommended. You bought enough paint to cover the whole shop, Sarah observed, looking at the amount of supplies. I'd rather have too much than too little. Chewy was already there, wearing an old t-shirt and with his hands covered in blue paint. I already started, he shouted, showing a wooden board where he had painted Barnes & Sons in crooked but enthusiastic letters. Chewy, that's not the shop sign, Sarah said. I know, I'm practicing. Robert laughed at the boy's dedication and began preparing the real sign for painting. Sarah helped him sand the surface and apply primer. You really don't know how to paint, she said, watching Robert struggle with the brush. I'm learning. You're making a mess. That's part of the learning process. Sarah grabbed another brush and started painting next to him. Her movements were much steadier, even though she had no experience with signs. How do you make this look so easy? Robert asked. Same as with engines, patience and instinct. They worked side by side all morning. Chewy acted as the official assistant, handing brushes, mixing colors, and giving artistic suggestions that weren't always practical. What if we make the letters green? He suggested. Why green? Sarah asked. I don't know. Green's nice. We'll stick with blue, Robert said. It matches the rest of the shop. As the sign took shape, Robert felt the same satisfaction he had when putting together the engine weeks before. There was something deeply rewarding about making something real with your own hands. This is looking good, Sarah said, stepping back to see their work. Really? Really? For someone who's never painted a sign before, you're doing well. Robert smiled, proud of the compliment. They finished painting late that afternoon. The sign looked much better than Robert expected. The letters were even, the color was bright, and the final result looked professional. It looks great, Chewy exclaimed, admiring their work. It really does, Sarah agreed. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. My pleasure. They started cleaning up the paint supplies when Robert noticed Sarah was quieter than usual. Something wrong? He asked. No, just thinking. About what? Sarah stopped cleaning the brush she was holding. How strange this all is. What? This, you here, helping with things that have nothing to do with your company. Painting signs, putting together engines, handing me tools. Robert didn't know how to answer. Is it strange in a bad way? I don't know yet. Chewy, sensing the tension, grabbed the radio and turned up the volume. A livelier song started playing. You're both too serious, he said. We just did some good work. We should be celebrating. Sarah forced a smile. Chewy's right, it really did turn out great. But Robert could tell something was bothering her. Sarah, Miss Barnes, if something's wrong... There's nothing wrong, she interrupted, a little sharply. Everything's fine. Doesn't sound like it. Mr. Mitchell, don't analyze me like I'm one of your business reports. The sharpness in her voice caught him off guard. I wasn't analyzing. I was trying to understand. Understand what? Why you suddenly got strange. Sarah set the brush down on the bench harder than needed. Maybe because I still don't understand what you really want here. What do you mean? You show up here every day, help with everything, act like you're part of the family. But I don't know if that's real or just another test." Robert frowned. "A test? To see if I'm trustworthy, if I'm competent enough, if I deserve you to fix my dad's situation." "Sarah, it's not like that. Isn't it? Then why do you still act like you're judging me all the time?" "I don't act like that. You do. You watch everything I do, analyze every word I say, like you're checking if I pass your approval test." Robert felt frustration rise. "That's not true." "Isn't it? Then why do you never fully relax? Why does it always seem like you're waiting for me to prove something?" "Because I want you to trust me." Robert exploded. The silence that followed was broken only by the music from the radio. Chewie stopped moving the brushes and looked at them. "I want you to trust me." Robert repeated quietly. "And I don't know how to make that happen." Sarah stared at him. "Mr. Mitchell, trust isn't something you earn through tests or approval. It's something you build through honesty. I've been honest. You've been polite, respectful, helpful, but honest. I'm not sure." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're still trying to impress me instead of just being yourself." Robert opened his mouth to argue but stopped. There was truth in what she said. He really was trying to impress her, trying to prove he deserved a chance to fix things. "You're right," he admitted. "Am I? I'm afraid if you get to know the real me, you won't like what you find." Sarah took a step toward him. "And who is the real you, Mr. Mitchell?" Robert took a deep breath. "Someone who spent 15 years sitting behind a desk making decisions about things he didn't understand. Someone who inherited a company and a fortune built on the work of others. Someone who never questioned where his success came from until he met you. Go on. Someone who's trying to learn to work with his hands because he realized he doesn't actually know how to do anything really useful. Someone who's in love with a woman who has every reason in the world to hate me." The air in the shop got heavy. Chewie stopped moving completely and was watching the conversation with wide eyes. Sarah looked at Robert for a long moment. "Do you really think I should hate you? I think it would be fair. And you think you're in love with me?" Robert felt his face burn. "I think, yes." Sarah took another step toward him. "Mr. Mitchell, you're really an idiot. I know." "No, you don't." She reached out and grabbed the collar of his shirt. "If you did, you'd understand I don't want you to try to impress me. What do you want?" "I want you to stop acting like you're asking permission to exist." "Sarah? I want you to understand that maybe, just maybe, I'm also interested in finding out who you really are underneath all that guilt and paranoia." Robert looked into her eyes and saw something he hadn't noticed before. Interest, curiosity, and maybe something more. "Sarah, She didn't let him finish. She pulled him by the collar and kissed him. It was a passionate kiss, full of frustration and held-back desire. Robert froze for a second, then responded, wrapping his arms around her. When they pulled apart, both were breathless. "Wow," Chewie murmured from across the shop. "That wasn't in the plan." Sarah looked at Robert, her eyes shining. "Mr. Mitchell?" "Yes? Stop calling me Sarah when we're alone. What should I call you?" "By my name, Sarah." "Better. And stop acting like you're testing me." "How should I act?" Sarah smiled, like someone who just found out maybe, just maybe, the feelings are mutual. Robert smiled back, feeling like a huge weight had lifted from his shoulders. "Chewie," Sarah shouted without taking her eyes off Robert, "can you turn up the music? I think we'll need a soundtrack for what's coming next." Chewie ran to the radio, grinning from ear to ear. "Finally," he shouted. "I knew you two would work it out." And as country music filled the shop, Robert Mitchell finally understood what Sarah meant about things that have a soul. Some things can't be analyzed or tested. They can only be felt. 2 weeks after the kiss, Robert arrived at the shop carrying a leather folder under his arm and a nervous smile on his face. Sarah was adjusting the suspension on a Jeep Wrangler, completely focused on her work. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, setting the folder on the bench. "Good morning." She looked at the folder suspiciously. "What's that?" "A proposal, something I've been thinking about for the past few weeks." Sarah stopped what she was doing and wiped her hands on a cloth. "What kind of proposal?" Robert took a deep breath. He'd rehearsed this moment for days, but now that it was here, he felt unsure. "A community mechanics school." For people like Chewy, who want to learn but can't afford expensive courses. Sarah raised an eyebrow. And why are you telling me this? Because I want it to be ours, our school. He opened the folder and took out a stack of organized documents. Architectural plans, detailed budgets, curriculum proposals, all printed on professional letterhead. Look at this, Sarah said, flipping through the papers. You really thought of everything, didn't you? I did. We can use the land next to the shop. Mr. Henderson has wanted to sell for years. We'll build a modern shop school with new equipment, but keep the spirit of Barnes & Sons. Sarah kept reading, but her expression grew darker. And the name? She asked. Barnes Motors Community Mechanics School. Barnes Motors. In honor of your father and you. Sarah reached the last page of the documents and stopped. There it was, the partnership contract. She read it once, then again, frowning. Robert, there's a mistake here. Where? Here in the contract. It says I'm co-founder and you're an investor partner. That's not a mistake. What do you mean it's not a mistake? You're paying for everything. You had the idea. Robert stepped closer to her. Sarah, the idea only came because I met you, because I learned there's a difference between teaching theory and teaching passion for the work. You'd be the technical director. I'd just be the funder. Robert, look at this. He pointed to a specific clause. 50% of the profits will go to a scholarship fund for underprivileged kids, like Chewy. Sarah looked at him in disbelief. Are you serious? Completely serious. Just then, Chewy came home from school, carrying his backpack and a big smile. Hi, everyone. What are you? He stopped when he saw the document spread out. What's all this? Crazy, Sarah muttered. Opportunity, Robert corrected. Chewy came closer and looked at the architectural plans. Is this a school? A mechanics school, Robert explained, to teach people who want to learn but can't afford expensive courses. Chewy's eyes lit up. Really? Could I study there? You'd be one of the first students, Robert said. Sarah shook her head. Robert, this is very generous, but I don't understand why you want to do this. Robert sat on a nearby stool. Because your father should have been recognized as the genius he was. Because kids like Chewy deserve the same chances I had. And because I want to build something that makes sense. And you think I'd be a good technical director? I think you'd be the best technical director possible. Sarah looked at the contract again, then at Chewy, who was studying the plans with fascination. There's one condition, she finally said. What? If I agree, you're going to get your hands greasy every day. No sitting in an office managing stuff. You'll teach, guide, work directly with the students. Robert smiled. I can live with that. And one more thing. Chewy will be our first student advisor. If he says something isn't working, we change it. Deal. Chewy jumped up with joy. I'm going to be an advisor, Sarah. Does that mean I get to help make decisions? It means you tell us if we're messing up, Sarah replied, smiling. Cool. Can I start now? Sarah looked at Robert one last time. Are you sure about this? It's a lot of money, a lot of work, a lot of risk. Sarah, for the first time in my life, I'm absolutely sure about something. She picked up a pen from the bench. Then, let's make history. And she signed the contract, making official the partnership that would change their lives forever. 6 months after signing the school contract, Robert Mitchell was in his basement at 2 a.m, holding a drill, sweat on his forehead. On his makeshift workbench, an 8-centimeter engine nut was being transformed into something completely different. He had started the project 3 weeks earlier, working in secret whenever Sarah wasn't around. Sanding, polishing, adjusting, repeating. His hands, now toughened from all the shop work, handled the tools with a precision he didn't have a year before. The nut had belonged to the original engine of the 1970s Chevelle. When they did the car's full overhaul, Robert had kept the piece, saying it was sentimental. Sarah had laughed, calling him an incurable romantic. If she only knew how romantic. Robert held the polished nut up to the light. The metal shone like silver, every surface perfectly smooth. In the center, where the bolt hole used to be, he had set a small diamond that had belonged to his mother's engagement ring. It wasn't conventional, definitely not traditional, but it was perfect for Sarah. The next morning, Robert arrived at the shop carrying a polished wooden box. Sarah was checking on the school's construction progress outside, watching workers install the last windows. It's looking beautiful, she said without taking her eyes off the building. Just like the technical director, Robert replied. Sarah laughed. Very sweet, Mr. Mitchell. Sarah, I need to talk to you about something. Go ahead. Not here, inside. She followed him into the shop, curious about the serious tone in his voice. Chewie was at school, so they had privacy. What is it? She asked. You seem different. Robert carefully set the box on the bench. Remember your dad's toolbox, the one you showed me on the first day? Of course, the E. Barnes. Why? You said it was broken. The latch didn't work anymore. That's right. I couldn't open it properly. Robert turned the box toward her. It was the same box, but fully restored. The metal gleamed, the latch worked perfectly, and the name E. Barnes had been re-engraved in deeper letters. Robert, how did you? I borrowed it 2 weeks ago, when you went out to buy parts. Sarah ran her hands over the box's surface, touched. It's perfect, exactly like it was when my dad bought it. Open it. Sarah flipped the latch. The box opened gently, revealing a blue velvet lining inside. In the center, where the tools usually were, sat a small white satin cushion, and on the cushion, the ring. Sarah stayed silent for a long moment, looking at the polished nut that shone like a precious jewel. Robert, this is an engine nut for my Chevelle, the one you fixed the first day we met. You made a ring from an engine nut. With the diamond from my mother's ring. Sarah carefully picked up the ring, turning it in the light. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. Robert felt his heart stop. Ridiculous? And at the same time, the most beautiful. He breathed a sigh of relief. Sarah Barnes, he said, kneeling by the bench, a year ago you fixed my engine in 10 minutes, but it took much longer for you to teach me that engines have a soul. Robert, you taught me how to work with my hands, to listen to what engines are telling me, to find satisfaction in fixing broken things. Sarah held the ring, her eyes shining. More importantly, you taught me that some things can't be bought or bargained for. They have to be built, with patience, honesty, and hard work. Keep going. I don't just want to build engines with you, Sarah. I want to build a life, a family, a future where we teach others that honest work and true love are the only things that really matter. Sarah knelt beside him. Robert Mitchell, are you asking me to marry you with a ring made from engine scrap? I am. In my dad's workshop next to a Jeep that needs its transmission fixed? I am. Sarah smiled, tears running down her face. Then my answer is yes. Of course it's yes. Robert slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. You're sure? He asked. It's going to be a different life. Grease on your hands, hard work, engine problems every day. Robert, I wouldn't change this life for anything. Not for all the traditional rings in the world. They kissed right there on the shop floor, with the smell of oil in the air and the sound of tools in the background. And when Chewie came home from school an hour later, he found them still hugging, planning a future built with their own hands. Finally, he shouted, "Can I be the best man?" You can, Sarah said, showing the ring, but only if you promise not to cry at the ceremony. I promise. Chewie lied, already emotional. And so, with laughs and tears, they started planning the most unusual wedding Brentwood, Tennessee had ever seen. The yard at Barnes & Sons Auto Repair had never held so many flowers. Strings of yellow lights hung between the trees, and chairs borrowed from the Methodist church formed an improvised aisle between the workbenches. It was Saturday, 10 in the morning, and Brentwood's most unusual wedding was about to begin. Robert Mitchell adjusted his navy blue coverall for the 5th time, trying to calm his nerves. The fabric was new, but the cut was the same as the ones he'd learned to wear in recent months. On the chest pocket, embroidered in gold letters, read, Barnes Motors, co-founder. You're more nervous than the first time you put together an engine, joked Harold, his uncle and best man. Much more nervous, Robert admitted, looking around. The guests were an odd mix. Executives from Mitchell Automotive sitting beside neighbors from the shop. Chewie had insisted on inviting the entire school class, who now filled 2 rows, whispering excitedly. The pastor from the Methodist church, a kind man named Reverend Williams, was organizing his notes on a bench covered with a white lace cloth. Next to him, the altar was decorated with old tools belonging to Sarah's father, polished until they shone like silver. Here she comes, Chewie shouted, running up to Robert. The boy wore a small, borrowed suit and carried a miniature toolbox, painted white and decorated with blue ribbons. Inside it were the wedding rings, both made by Robert using the same method as the polished nut, but smaller and more delicate. The music started. It wasn't the traditional wedding march, but At Last by Etta James, playing on the same old radio Chewie had brought months ago. And then Sarah appeared. She walked alone, she had insisted on that. Wearing a white coverall she had embroidered herself with small blue flowers. Her hair was loose, with a simple daisy crown. On her feet, her usual work boots, clean and polished. Robert felt as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Sarah was radiant, smiling with a mix of happiness and mischief he had learned to love. "Breathing helps," Harold whispered in his ear. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. Reverend Williams spoke about true partnerships, about building something lasting together, about finding beauty in life's simple things. When it was time for the vows, Robert pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "Sarah," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "you taught me that the best things in life don't come ready-made. They have to be built, piece by piece, with patience and love." Sarah smiled, her eyes shining. "You taught me that engines have a soul, that honest work is the greatest wealth, and that sometimes the right person shows up at the right time to fix everything that was broken in our lives." Chewie sniffled audibly in the front row. "I promised to build our life together, just like you taught me to build engines. Listening, adjusting, fixing when needed, and always, always with love." Sarah wiped a tear and shared her own vows. "Robert, you came here a lost man, trying to impress everyone. But you found out that true impressing comes from hard-working hands and an honest heart." She took his hands, rough from so much work. "I promise to teach you everything I know about engines and life, as long as you keep teaching me that it's never too late to start over." Chewie stepped forward with the little toolbox, opening it solemnly. The rings shone inside the lined box. "With these rings, do you both promise to build a life together?" asked Reverend Williams. "Yes," they answered in unison. "Then, by the authority given to me, and by the power of true love we witness here today, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The crowd erupted in applause. Chewie was jumping for joy. Even the most serious executives from Mitchell Automotive were smiling. "Now let's open the real wedding gift," Chewie shouted. Robert and Sarah walked hand in hand to the newly built school. In front of the building, covered by a white cloth, was the engine they had built together on the very first day. The 1965 Mustang, now mounted on a special stand with a golden plaque. "First Barnes engine, in memory of Edward Barnes, visionary." "Together?" Robert asked. Sarah nodded. They pulled the cloth back at the same time, revealing the polished, gleaming engine. Robert turned the key. The engine roared to life, perfect and powerful. Neighbors clapped, children cheered, and music filled the air. Sarah came close to Robert and whispered in his ear, "Now you're a man of your word, and of engines." Robert kissed her right there, in the middle of the celebration, with the sound of the engine they had built together echoing in the background. "We did it," he said. "Did what?" "Build something that will last forever." Sarah smiled, looking around, at Chewie dancing with the kids, at the school that would teach generations of mechanics, at the engine purring like a promise for the future. "Robert Mitchell, you finally learned the difference between machines and engines with a soul." "Learned?" "Yes, because now you know the best things in life can't be bought. It can only be built. With love, hard work, and lots of patience." And while the party went on around them, Robert and Sarah stayed wrapped in each other's arms. What did you think of Sarah and Robert's story? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to follow all our stories, and check out more emotional stories by clicking here on the end screen.